The year was 1955. The world was divided, not by language, not by culture, but by ideology. Democracy and communism, two opposing forces, were locked in a Cold War, and Vietnam became their battleground. This was the year when one of the longest and most controversial conflicts of the 20th century was about to begin. The Vietnam War, a war that spanned nearly 2 decades, was a testament to the resilience of the Vietnamese people and their determination to shape their own destiny.
Planes from our carrier force take off to strafe and bomb.
In the long history of mankind, there has never been a war which has demanded such complex tactics and so many sophisticated weapons as the war in Vietnam.
The insurgents counterattacked time and again, but were thrown back each time. The fighting raged for days as both sides brought in more forces. The high point, however, was that the Viet Cong attacked across the airstrip in 3 waves, were stopped by howitzers, firing at point-blank range.
The Vietnam War is usually written off as a colossal strategic blunder and a humanitarian disaster.
This is the story of the Vietnam War, a tale of courage, sacrifice, and hard-won peace. Vietnam had been a colony of France since the 1800s, but during World War II, Japan invaded and occupied the country. After the war, a nationalist leader named Ho Chi Minh declared independence. For his communist-led Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV in the north, he fought against the French, who tried to regain control of Vietnam with the help of the US and other countries. In 1954, after a decisive battle at Dien Bien Phu, the French agreed to end the war and withdraw from Vietnam. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam into 2 parts along the 17th parallel, with the DRV in the north and the state of Vietnam in the south, led by a pro-Western leader named Ngo Dinh Diem. The Accords also called for a nationwide election in 1956 to reunify the country, but this never happened. Diem refused to hold the election, fearing that Ho Chi Minh would win. He also faced opposition from various groups in the south, including the Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla force that was supported by the DRV in the north. Diem was a corrupt and unpopular leader who suppressed the Buddhist majority and favored the Catholic minority. He also received increasing aid and advisors from the US, who saw him as a bulwark against communism in Southeast Asia. In 1960, the DRV formed the National Liberation Front (NLF), a political and military organization that aimed to overthrow Diem and reunite Vietnam under communist rule. The NLF, also known as the Viet Cong, launched a guerrilla war against the South Vietnamese government and its allies. The DRV also sent supplies and troops to the south via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of paths and tunnels that crossed the borders of Laos and Cambodia. In 1964, the US escalated its involvement in the war after a reported attack by North Vietnamese patrol boats on US naval vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Lyndon B. Johnson obtained congressional authorization to use military force in Vietnam. Without a formal declaration of war, he ordered a massive bombing campaign against the DRV, known as Operation Rolling Thunder, and sent the first US combat troops to Vietnam. The main parties in the conflict were the Communist government of North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh Party, and the anti-communist government of South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem and his Republic of Vietnam Party. The North Vietnamese wanted to reunify the country under their rule, while the South Vietnamese wanted to maintain their independence and sovereignty. The conflict was also influenced by the global rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, who were engaged in the Cold War. The US supported the South Vietnamese as part of its policy of containment, which aimed to prevent the spread of communism in Asia and elsewhere. The Soviet Union and its ally China supported the North Vietnamese, as part of their strategy of expansion, which aimed to promote communism and challenge the US influence in the world. The conflict was also affected by the national liberation movements of other countries in Southeast Asia, such as Laos and Cambodia, who were also fighting against colonialism and imperialism. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla force in the south, used these countries as bases and routes for their infiltration and supply. The US and its allies intervened in these countries to disrupt the communist activities and to prop up friendly regimes. The conflict was also shaped by the domestic and international public opinion, which was divided and polarized by the war. The war sparked anti-war protests and movements in the US and around the world, as many people questioned the morality and necessity of the war. The war also generated propaganda and censorship in both the North and the South, as both sides tried to justify their actions and to influence the hearts and minds of the people. The conflict was also marked by the atrocities and human rights violations committed by both sides, which caused immense suffering and trauma to the civilians and the combatants. The war resulted in the reunification of Vietnam under the communist rule of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, which still exists today. The war also ended the colonial era in Southeast Asia, as Laos and Cambodia also became independent from France. However, the war also left behind a legacy of violence, instability, and human rights abuses in these countries, especially in Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge regime committed genocide against millions of people. The war also had a huge impact on the United States, both domestically and internationally. The war cost the lives of more than 58,000 Americans and wounded more than 300,000. The war also consumed billions of dollars and resources, diverting them from other social and economic needs. The war also eroded the public trust and confidence in the government, the military, and the media, as many people felt betrayed and disillusioned by the lies, corruption, and cover-ups that surrounded the war. The war also had a significant impact on the global order and the balance of power. The war demonstrated the limits of the US power and influence, as well as the resilience and determination of the communist forces. The war also contributed to the détente and the rapprochement between the US and China, as well as the US and the Soviet Union, as they sought to reduce the tensions and the risks of a nuclear war. It also influenced the subsequent conflicts and interventions in other parts of the world, such as the Middle East, Central America, and Africa, as the US and other countries learned from the lessons and the mistakes of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a controversial and devastating war that divided and changed the world. It involved a struggle between communism and anti-communism, as well as the quest for national liberation and self-determination. It caused immense suffering and destruction, as well as political, social, and cultural upheaval. It also taught us many lessons, both positive and negative, about war and peace, power and justice, and humanity and dignity. It was a war that we should never forget, but also a war that we should never repeat. It was a war that we should learn from, but also a war that we should heal from. It was a war that we should honor, but also a war that we should mourn. It was a war that we should remember, but also a war that we should transcend.